Hi, welcome everyone. Welcome to this Ernest Becker Foundation webinar. My name is Aurora Strauss-Reeves, and I'm the outreach coordinator at the EBF. Thank you all for being here so much. And a big thank you to all of those who supported us with a donation today. We really appreciate that. So I'm sure all of you know, or some of you know a little bit about the EBF already, but just to recap, the Ernest Becker Foundation examines the ways in which the human awareness of our own mortality affects our beliefs and behaviors on both an individual and societal level. We believe that understanding the function of death anxiety can provide tools to help us live more easily together. So today's presentation will be on using the ideas of Ernest Becker in the educational setting. So I know for me personally, I'm a college student, and when I discovered these ideas, it fundamentally changed the way that I thought about every class that I took in college. I'm a politics major, and I take a lot of politics classes, philosophy classes, anthropology classes, and all of those classes very much intersect with Becker's ideas, which is really interesting. But what's also, I think, kind of weird is none of my professors ever talk about Ernest Becker and how the awareness of death intersects with these ideas. And so it's always, going in the back of my head when we're talking about certain topics. And I'm like, I think Becker would have something to say in this topic specifically. And sometimes I bring it up, sometimes I don't. But it's definitely interesting to see just how applicable Becker is in, the academia field and in education. So now I'm going to introduce the moderator. Today's moderator is someone who uses Becker's ideas in the classroom almost every day. So with no further ado, I will introduce Lindsay Harville-Bowman. Lindsay is an associate professor in the School of Communication Studies at JMU, and Lindsay leads the Terror Management Lab at JMU, and you can follow their research and updates on social media at Lab Terror. So now, Lindsay, you can take it away.
Awesome. Thank you. And thank you to Ernest Becker Foundation for asking me to moderate. Yes, I do use Ernest Becker every single day in terror management theory at James Madison University. So I'm excited to have this conversation today. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panelists, and then we're going to have a brief chat, and we will end with question and answer. So first up, we have Catherine Van Kessel. She is a former high school social studies teacher from Canada and is currently an associate professor of curriculum studies in the Department of Counseling, Societal Change, and Inquiry at Texas Christian University on the ancestral homelands of the Wichita and affiliated tribes. She is also core faculty in the Center for Public Education and Community Engagement at TCU. Her research centers on how different conceptualizations of evil might help shift thinking and feeling toward less harmful sociopolitical relations, including Ernest Becker's insights about how often we create evil by trying to destroy it, as well as how an awareness of worldview threat and defense from terror management theory can function in classrooms. You can find her on TikTok, Twitter, and Instagram at Dr. Evil Academic. Catherine also created an amazing teaching resource for lesson plans based on the ideas of Ernest Becker and terror management theory, which we will put in the chat. If you registered for this webinar, you will also receive a link to it afterwards, and I highly recommend you take a look at that. It is quite something. Next, we have Melissa McQueen, who teaches high school social studies in rural Alberta, Canada. She uses pop culture and the theories of Ernest Becker and terror management theory as a backdrop for her courses to help students navigate through and with difficult knowledge that they encounter throughout the curriculum and with current events. Melissa is currently a graduate student at the University of Alberta for secondary education, as well as the 2022 recipient of the Prime Minister's Award for Teaching Excellence with the Certificate of Achievement. Congratulations, Melissa. That's awesome. Next, we have Sam Fairlam. And Sam is a senior teaching fellow at Royal Holloway at the University of London in the psychology department. Sam's research interests include terror management theory, and he co-coordinates a module called The Psychology of Love, Death, and Meaning, where he teaches existential ideas to students. Sam is passionate about supporting students and runs a YouTube channel called The Psychology Debrief, which is aimed at students studying psychology in higher education. Our panelists are now going to give a little brief talk about how they use these ideas in the classroom, and then we will open it up to question and answer. So if you have questions, please put them in the YouTube chat. I think it's to your right, if I remember correctly. So first up, we have Catherine to talk about worldview threat in the classroom. Catherine, it is all yours.
Thank you so much. Just give me a moment to share my screen here. Lindsay, can you give me a thumbs up? That's good? Excellent, thank you. All right, so hello everyone. Thank you for being here, and many thanks to the Ernest Becker Foundation for organizing this webinar, as well as all the amazing work that you do. I'm a huge fan, as you know. I've got a few slides to share with all of you about how I teach students about Ernest Becker and terror management theory. I'm not going to explain the exact content a lot, but since the focus is on, kind of the how, but please let me know if you have any questions, and please feel free to email me or visit my open educational resource, the Grim Educator, that Lindsay so kindly mentioned. So in the context that I've been teaching, it's been sort of 2 geographical locations, 2 mid-sized cities, Edmonton in Canada and Fort Worth in the United States. And this has been a little bit with high school students, mostly with Bachelor of Education students studying to become social studies teachers, as well as with graduate students. I've also done some professional development for teachers and administrators. And I'll be really excited to do this for the first time with undergraduates here in Texas to see kind of what's different, what's similar, and all that. And it's been mostly in person, but a little bit online as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what I teach and then how. This is my plan. So as Ernest Becker says, the paradox is that evil comes from man's urge to heroic victory over evil. Although Becker had strong opinions about education, primarily I've had students engage with his ideas about evil. In part, this is because of my research interest in evil, and in part because I think it's a really engaging way to start thinking about teaching things like contested issues, which is a focus of mine. So Ernest Becker talked about how the idea of death haunts us, sometimes without us even being aware of it. But it's hard for people to accept this. And so I'm grateful to Jeff Greenberg, Tom Buzinski, and Sheldon Solomon, who took Becker's ideas and tested them, thus creating terror management theory. After decades of research and hundreds of experiments, it's pretty safe to say that Becker was really onto something. And I find that sharing this robust body of research from terror management theory is helpful. I often tell students that, I anticipate them to be skeptical of Becker's claims, but then by sharing some of the research, they usually warm up to the idea, and especially since a number of the studies are quite clever. I think they appreciate that as well. The part of terror management theory that concerns what I'm talking about today is the part about worldview, threat, and defense. So worldviews are shared conceptualizations of reality that provide us with a sense of stability, with a sense of security in an insecure world. So when our worldviews are threatened, such as when we're talking about a contested or controversial issue, we defend that worldview like our lives depend on it, because, to our bodies and minds, it feels like it does. And so I spent some time with students naming and describing these defenses. We named several defenses, and you can see 4 of them on the screen here. We talk about, what we're going to call them, what they are, examples from in and out of the classroom, and importantly, like how they're functioning. And then I spend some time with them talking about how we might prevent or mitigate those defensive reactions. I don't have time to go over these in a huge amount of detail during our time today, but there are a number of things that we can do before and during our interactions with people who have opposing worldviews. So I've just put a quick list up here. So one of the things I've really been focusing on is developing a shared language for emotions and defenses. And I'll give some examples of this in a few moments of, when these defenses bubble up in a classroom, if we're able to name it, describe it, have a shared understanding, I think we can work through that a little bit differently. Drawing from research done in the 90s, as well as more recent work by the wonderful Sam Fairland, who's here today, thinking about, helpful values, and not only yours, but of the people that you might be talking about who perhaps have different views. Also boosting self-esteem to kind of provide us with this comfort. I'm really interested in the fact that reading comprehension decreases when we're in a state of worldview threat. So how can we bring in, videos and infographics, or even just, readings at a lower reading comprehension level to sort of help with that. There are times when self-segregation are helpful, particularly when people are, gaining a basic understanding of some sort of form of structural violence, like racism. Sometimes it's good to have some separate groups, but for the most part, we want people to be together, but they will existentially not necessarily want that. So how can we sort of manage that situation? And if we are in a situation where a student or a colleague derogates another or calls for their annihilation, which are, obviously offensive defenses, how do we deal with that situation? Like, it's kind of a classroom management relationship question. How can we pivot students away from wanting, so passionately to convert someone to their point of view, or to feel that if they've had a superficial engagement, if they've done this defensive accommodation, or we might think of it as appropriation, to let them know that that's not really an engagement, that's at the surface, we've done enough, and move on. So it's these nudges in these different directions that I'm really interested in. In terms of how I teach them, I've really been working on this over the years, mostly through trial and error and failure. So I found it really helpful, particularly recently with the countless deaths due to COVID and all the things that come along with that, to warn students that they've recently experienced the loss of a loved one, that learning about Becker and terror management theory might feel really uncomfortable. So even when I'm giving a formal presentation, like I'll let them know that it's okay to distract themselves with their phone, or even leave the room if they need a break. And this seems to help, just warning someone, they might feel it kind of helps them not get caught off guard, I think. At first, when I taught terror management theory, I wasn't as careful about how I talk about religious views giving us a sense of immortality. What I've learned over the last several years is to note that although religions provide existential comfort because of afterlife beliefs, so do secular beliefs. And I even play them a song called Memory and the First Law of Thermodynamics, and talk about the beliefs that I share with my father, who is a former physics teacher. I then carefully note that terror management theory doesn't say that any of these religious or secular worldviews are right or wrong. Just instead, the terror management theory reveals how these worldviews function. So I'm just going to play you a few seconds of Patershik's song.
Physicists say folks don't go away, that all things continue to be. That all of you floats about in the blue. You're just less orderly.
Another nice thing about using music is, again, because of what we know about reading comprehension, it's another modality. And also in teaching, it's generally a good thing to kind of shake things up. And if we can convey sort of knowledge in these different ways, I've found that to be sort of a way to lure people towards knowledge that might be emotionally difficult. Following the wonderful Neil Elgee, I use humor during my lessons on Becker and terror management theory to relieve some existential anxiety. Of course, it's important never to be distasteful. We don't want to make light of death, again, especially if we're in the situation where, we have lost someone close to us. But there are a lot of really cute comics out there that seem to do the trick. So usually they get a few giggles, or at least they laugh at me if they're not even laughing at the comic itself, which either way, it still works. And finally, because we know that reading comprehension can just go down the drain when we encounter worldview threat, I use a lot of videos as well as images like infographics with students during lessons on Becker and terror management theory, as well as later when we talk about hot button issues like racism, sexism, ableism, the climate crisis, and so on. On the screen are a couple examples I developed with the support of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, a video on worldview threat and an infographic, both designed for classroom use to develop that shared language for worldview defenses that I mentioned earlier. It's really not hyperbole to say that Becker and terror management theory have fundamentally shifted what I teach, how I teach, as well as how I live my life. I'll leave it at this for now, but I really look forward to questions later and to hear what my co-presenters will share as well. So thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Catherine. I really appreciated your great and inclusive approaches to helping students manage these difficult topics in the classroom, and that skepticism is real. In the classroom, I meet it a lot as well, and just out in the world when we talk about these ideas with people. So understandable, but hard to handle for sure. So next up, we have Sam. Sam is going to discuss how self-esteem manages death anxiety and how this plays an important role in education. Sam, all yours.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Can you just let me know you can see my screen? Okay, brilliant. Thank you. So I won't spend sort of too much time talking about Becker again, because I think Catherine's already eloquently explained his kind of core ideas. But just to kind of give a brief reiteration, essentially what Becker illuminates on in The Denial of Death, as well as other books, is the idea that human beings hold an unconscious death anxiety, which ultimately we manage through a sense that we try and find meaning in this world. So we buy into and adopt cultural worldviews, which Catherine talked about, the ideas of worldview threat in the classroom. But also we try and see our sense of value in the context of the culture that we subscribe to. And in psychologists, we might call this self-esteem, which is what I'm going to talk about more today in the next sort of 10 minutes or so. As Catherine also pointed out, Becker's ideas were turned into a social psychological theory known as terror management theory, which really tried to provide an empirically testable framework for Becker's ideas. And almost around about 40 years of empirical assessment has illuminated on the numerous ways in which human beings try to manage death-related concerns. And obviously, Catherine mentioned some of the defensive mechanisms that people may engage in when they're confronted with alternative worldviews. What I'm going to do in the sort of next 10 minutes is to really focus on the role of sort of self-esteem and how it manages death anxiety. So what I'll first of all briefly do is just give a bit of lip service to the research done by terror management theory that outlines how self-esteem has death anxiety buffering properties. And then if we accept that first assumption and the evidence that's portrayed, we can then start to consider the empirical research that has been done around self-esteem and its relationship to an educational domain. Now, obviously, there's a bit of a caveat here where the work that I'm going to talk about, therefore, looks at self-esteem, and we're going to add on that existential dimension by accepting point 1 on the screen here. But it would be great in the future maybe to consider trying to offer more direct evidence and empirical support for the role of death anxiety. So maybe some of my co-presenters here, or maybe some of you guys who are listening in who are really enthused about doing this kind of stuff may consider this an interesting area to pursue down the line. And then very briefly at the end is trying to consider some of the implications of this work. How might we consider trying to deal with some of the issues of self-esteem in an educational domain how should we try and think about, say, for example, giving feedback to students, given that it might often be something which is quite threatening to their self-esteem. So just to kind of briefly cover point one in relation to the idea that self-esteem manages death anxiety, terror management theory is generally circulated around three hypotheses that provide converging support for the idea that self-esteem manages our death-related concerns. First of all, we have what's called the mortality salient hypothesis, and these studies basically look at reminding participants of their mortality, and a control group are not reminded of that. And then we try and examine how people strive for self-esteem. And particularly the studies show that obviously depending on the way in which you see your self-esteem being contingent, so the way in which you see things being valuable, so the way in which you might consider whether your appearance makes you feel good, or whether maybe driving recklessly is a way that you can enhance your self-esteem. Basically, people strive for self-esteem in the domains that they see relevant to them after being reminded of their mortality. Then we have the second hypothesis, which is called the anxiety buffering hypothesis. And this idea is essentially that if self-esteem manages our death anxiety, then if we, in a laboratory, try and enhance people's self-esteem, maybe by giving them feedback on a personality assessment that says they've got a fantastic personality, or we give them feedback that suggests they're really intelligent, so temporarily increasing their self-esteem, then what we tend to find in these experiments is that that reduces reactions to the way people might normally react to death reminders. So Catherine talked about how people might respond defensively to alternative worldviews. Well, studies using anxiety buffering hypothesis show that when we elevate self-esteem, this tends to mitigate those sorts of reactions. And then we have the third hypothesis, which is the death thought accessibility hypothesis, which is essentially the inverse of the mortality salient hypothesis, which is the idea that if self-esteem manages our death concerns, then ultimately if we try and threaten temporarily that self-esteem, whether, for example, by having people think they didn't do very well on a test, then that should increase people's death-related thoughts at that point in time. And as I said, these three hypotheses and these three ways of testing the theory provide us converging support for how we might consider self-esteem to manage our concerns about death anxiety, as Becker outlined in his books. So let's move to the idea of, therefore, self-esteem in an educational domain. Now, to do so, what I'm going to do is I'm going to explicitly focus on what's called academic contingent self-esteem. We could consider what we might call global self-esteem, which is your general evaluation of the self. And obviously, people vary in whether they have generally high or quite low self-esteem. And whilst that's obviously relevant to understanding how students may react to certain things in an educational domain, I'm going to limit myself to what we call academic contingent self-esteem, which is basically the idea that you see your educational pursuits as relevant to your self-worth. So ultimately, doing well on a test or getting good feedback from your teacher, getting a great degree, ultimately makes you feel like you are a person of value, as Becker points out in his books. Now, generally speaking, there are some benefits to pursuing self-esteem from your academic studies. Ultimately, it increases motivation to engage in your studies. So studies sort of show that people are more likely to increase or report, basically spend more time studying. However, the kind of benefits that we might consider from deriving self-esteem in this manner probably don't really outweigh the costs that we might think there are associated with it when we think about the deficits it can have to one's learning and success in an educational domain. So I'm just going to briefly outline a couple of ways in which self-esteem from sort of empirical research has sort of shown may undermine actually good, effective learning and pursuit of success in education. So the first thing to note is that whilst when people try and pursue self-esteem from their academic studies, when they see doing well on tests as being barometers of their self-worth, whilst it can increase engagement with their education, that engagement is quite fragile. The motivation that accompanies academic contingent self-esteem can be quite quickly lost and no longer pursued, because ultimately people want to feel that they are people of value, as Becker points out. And when the going gets tough and people start to be concerned that maybe they're not going to do as well as they might hope, they basically cut off and decrease their engagement. So the persistence they have with their goals in an educational domain are quite fragile. So kind of studies tend to show that people who have academic contingencies of self-esteem when they don't do well on a test tend to show poor kind of goal regulation thereafter. People and students more specifically who have academic contingent self-esteem also select what we would call self-validating goals. These are basically goals that allow oneself to feel like they are demonstrating their competence, but not actually necessarily thinking about how we can develop that competence. When we think about this from a kind of learning perspective, learning and improvement really requires you to kind of step outside of your comfort zone, to acquire new skills, to learn new things, to do new things, and really to master your domain requires you therefore to put yourself out there and try and basically essentially risk failure by trying to develop. But ultimately, because failure is quite damaging for people who hold academic contingent self-esteem, they tend not to do this. They'd rather select goals that are easier to acquire and therefore make them feel like they have acquired a sense of value, but don't necessarily go about developing their skills as a student that may go on to help them improve in their degree, for example, or maybe go on to develop their careers and so forth as well. Another thing that's been found in the literature is that essentially people who hold academic contingencies of self-esteem tend to react to failure quite strongly. I think this is something that anyone who's ever taught students, or maybe even if you're a student yourself, you can think of a time when you didn't do as well as you had hoped. And then you often have quite intense reactions to that failure. Well, academic contingent self-esteem is something that often drives these kind of intense reactions where people feel very negative about the failure that they might have experienced when they've underperformed on a test. It may also lead to defensive reactions similar to what Catherine outlined, where the goal is essentially to try and protect your self-esteem after it's been threatened by maybe, for example, blaming a marker for being too critical, or considering that the test that was developed was unfair in some way. We can use a variety of different strategies that help us to try and protect ourselves from when failure occurs and it damages our self-esteem to do so. But moreover, because failure is actually quite damaging for us, we often therefore might engage in what's called self-handicapping strategies to actually prevent the sting of failure from ever occurring if it were to occur. What we mean by self-handicapping strategies is essentially any kind of strategy you can think of that provides you a ready excuse for failure if that failure were to occur. So we might think about how maybe a student who didn't try so hard on a test as they might have done so, maybe they decided that it was more appropriate to binge watch The Crown on Netflix the night before an exam rather than really studying for the exam itself. Maybe they decided to go out and get blisteringly drunk and try and do the exam with a hangover. All of these ways are obviously going to be counterintuitive to succeeding, yet actually they serve quite a vital psychological function of protecting ourselves from situations that can be very threatening, because then when failure may occur down the line, we now have an excuse to point to where we can say it's got nothing to do with maybe my competence and my ability, but actually it's because I didn't try as hard as I might, or I was under the weather and I was hungover, so it wasn't my best performance. And interestingly enough, also, if you were to self-handicap and succeed, then you kind of get a double shot of boost to your self-esteem, where not only did you do well on a test, which feels great, but then you also know you did it under conditions where you were essentially limited in your ability to succeed. So that can really make you at that point feel like you are on top of the world and feel kind of greater than your mortal self, which Becker often talks about. Students with academic contingent self-esteem also experience high test anxiety. They have a strong need to perform well, because ultimately self-esteem is our symbolic armor against these death-related concerns. So students who pursue self-esteem in an academic domain feel real intense need to perform well on tests, and ultimately that leads to high anxiety. And unfortunately, studies show that experiencing that test anxiety leads to underperformance on those tests, which therefore is likely to lead to the previous point where students are more likely, through having this high need to perform well, may react to failure poorly as well. Ultimately, a lot of what I've described, really kind of suggests that students who derive self-esteem in this way are kind of put through a psychological ringer, so to speak. If you think about an educational context, students on a routinely basis are put up against assessments, whether it's an exam or a piece of coursework, in class with questions that they might have from their teacher and so forth. And this need to always perform well, this worry that you might get something wrong, and so on and so forth, really ultimately culminates in decreased well-being. So it's linked with increased stress, increased depression, and so forth. So, I mean, ultimately what the kind of research suggests is that self-esteem really takes precedence over other concerns that we might have that might be more important from a learning perspective: the development of ourselves, the acquiring of new skills, the development of our competence. Often self-esteem gets in the way of those things. And, as a kind of summary of what I said, one thing is that we don't get outside of our comfort zone because we're worried that we might fail, or we might not succeed, and that would be damaging for our self-esteem. But also it disrupts that learning cycle, that if you're someone who's a pedagogic instructor, you may have learned about learning cycles and the importance of feedback in the process of helping students develop. Well, ultimately, when a student doesn't do so well and they react negatively to the feedback and they don't really accept it, they try to criticize a marker, for example, or refuse to listen to the feedback, it limits their ability to develop in the future, which ultimately is going to just increase the likelihood of failing again in the future. In the same way that another reaction, as I mentioned, might be to just decrease your persistence with your goals. You might give up. But again, by giving up and not trying to succeed again, you're more likely to increase the chance of failure occurring. And it can become really a sort of vicious cycle as you go throughout your studies. And ultimately also, as I mentioned, is that it often makes us withdraw from our goals. It makes us withdraw from our studies. We may pursue engaging in those studies, but only up until the point when we start to feel concerned that we may not succeed. And obviously education is meant to be challenging, which means that therefore we often do worry about whether we will succeed. We may actually then end up withdrawing our effort and reducing our engagement. So very finally, just a couple of strategies that I would sort of suggest if you're someone who teaches and thinking about how you might use these ideas in your own teaching. Here's just a few, but I'm sure we can talk more in the chat as well later on about other things that you could potentially do. Well, one thing that you could consider doing is, first of all, whenever you try and deliver feedback to students, is to affirm their value, affirm their self-esteem, whether this is through a piece of coursework where you're writing the feedback, or maybe in a classroom. Always just kind of value maybe the contribution that they've tried to make, even if maybe it wasn't quite the right answer you were looking for. Something we're often taught of as instructors here in Royal Holloway is an idea of a sandwich feedback, that ultimately you try and start with a positive piece of thing about what a student's done and then move to the criticisms. We can start to understand why people really suggest this as a way of offering feedback by now understanding the role of self-esteem, and then furthermore understanding why ultimately we need to feel that we are people of value, according to Becker. Another thing that we should consider doing as educators is try and consider promoting realistic and less rigid bases of self-esteem, at least in the UK, and I'm sure maybe it's true also in Canada and the US, where I know lots of my co-presenters are. There's a real strong emphasis on good grades and the need to acquire them. Students are acutely aware of the need to feel like they get these good grades, but ultimately it's going to lead to some not reaching those standards, which can be a psychological, can be a recipe for psychological despair, essentially. And I think it's important that we try and remind students as educators that grades isn't everything in an educational domain. That, ultimately some of the things I talked about, like getting outside your comfort zone and challenging yourself, those are valued skills that you can take in the real world to an employer that they're going to value as well. And I think those are things that everyone can attain, and maybe best things that we could try and promote within our own educational classrooms. And very finally, other studies sort of suggest that maybe we should try and teach students to see failure as a way to learn. I'm sure all of us who are on the call right now have experienced a time where we didn't do a good grade, or maybe as kind of researchers getting negative feedback from particularly reviewer 2 who really didn't see the merits of your work. But ultimately, you need to see those things as an opportunity to learn and grow. And it can be very easy just to quickly dismiss the negative feedback we're given, but we need to also try and come to terms with it and accept that it's a way that we can grow as individuals too. So I'm sure there'll be many questions that I can answer. I hope that was useful and interesting. Over to you, Lindsay.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I will wait for you to unshare your screen.
Yep, sorry.
Nope, you're fine.
Yeah, I'm just trying to see how to do it.
At the bottom.
At the bottom.
Share. Perfect. Yep, at the very bottom of the Zoom where it says share.
Sorry, it's because I put you guys, I'm on 2 screens and I put you guys on the other screen, I think. So
no, you're fine.
Oh, stop video. No. See, this is where you should get into. Oh, hang on. There we are. Found it.
Perfect.
Ultimately, this 3 years of a pandemic and you still can't figure out how to use the internet.
Hey, we're all still rusty. But thank you. Thank you for that. You're doing really important work in this area. And so it's been a real treat to listen to that and have you share it with us and everyone else that has joined us today. So thank you. Next up, we have, and certainly last but not least, we have Melissa, who will discuss how she uses terror management theory to help high school students better engage with difficult topics that can remind them of their mortality and the type of projects and assignments that she uses within this engagement. Melissa.
Awesome. Thank you. Just give me one quick sec. Can you guys see my screen? Hearing that nobody's against it, I'm going to say, yes, you can. So hi, I'm Melissa McQueen. I am a high school social studies teacher in Alberta, Canada, specifically in rural Alberta. So one interesting thing about being in rural Alberta, we are a small oil field town. So a lot of our jobs are based on the oil field. And so the boom and bust cycle is really, really volatile in the community that I'm in. And so with that comes this idea of looming death, especially with death of the economy constantly within our community. And so if you really want to feel how death reminders and mortality kind of play out, definitely go to rural Alberta. You're going to get some really interesting responses. So if you do want to reach me, my email is at the bottom of the slide, mcqueen@ualberta.ca. So first off, why do I use TMT in the classroom? So I actually used to be a former student of Dr. Catherine von Kessel. I drank the Kool-Aid pretty on in my pre-service teaching career. So when I was learning how to be a social studies teacher, she brought up this idea of terror management theory in a couple of her classes. And I'm like, oh, that actually really makes a lot of sense, especially with the social studies curriculum here in Canada and in Alberta specifically. So TMT allows both students and teachers the ability to have language to understand how they are engaging with content and how to grapple with the uncomfortable feelings that come with it, especially in the realm of social studies. In Alberta, the social studies program of studies contains topics such as history, economics, politics, geography, philosophy, ideology, civics, and a bunch of other things just kind of hodgepodge together. It's because we have all these incredibly deep and in-depth topics, but have such a short time period to teach it, that usually we give the kids the information or that knowledge, but we don't really tell them or show them how to process that knowledge and how to feel about things. So giving kids the language to understand, why am I feeling, uncomfortable? Why am I feeling anxious? Why am I feeling angry? And why am I not able to understand some of the concepts that are being taught? Using TMT and the idea of people engaging with their mortality really helps students kind of understand, oh, that's why I'm feeling the way I'm feeling. That's why I'm having a little bit more difficult with the content in front of me. The multi-layeredness on top of emotionally charged topics really add a lot of layering to this in the Alberta Program of Studies in grade 11, we have a mini genocide unit where we talk about like the Holodomor, we talk about the Holocaust, we talk about the Rwandan genocide and other genocides that are more contemporary in nature as well. We also deal with a lot of extensive evils in social studies, where we talk about things such as colonialism and slavery and the legacies of residential schools, where Canada is unearthing a lot of trauma that Indigenous people here in Canada have been discussing for decades, and people that are part of the settler and non-settler communities are starting to realize the horrificness of colonialism here in Canada. And so kind of grappling with this unearthing of this new knowledge, literally and metaphorically speaking, has been really difficult for a lot of students to be able to kind of grapple with. So giving them language to understand why are they feeling this kind of need to push back with this knowledge has really been impactful. So in lesson plan building, I use TMT quite frequently when I'm discussing how to even build my lesson. So considering the pretext and the context of the lesson, what are my students bringing into the lesson? So understanding who my students are. What are some of the economic turmoils in my community that are going around? What are the different demographics of my students? For example, in Drayton Valley, we have an incredibly rich population, but then also an incredibly poor and impoverished population living side by side. And so kind of having these two worlds colliding makes it so that I have to be able to kind of walk through this world and understand how my students are. I also provide an opportunities to discuss what we're going to be discussing with students. So I like to let them know what we're going to be discussing. And I usually give them a day or two in advance, being like, hey, just a heads up, this is what we're going to be learning about, just so that they can emotionally prepare themselves. And I talk about how it might be impactful for their lives. So I bring up, okay, this current event is linked to this idea in history that we've been learning about. So in that way, students can kind of do some research if they want. They can kind of emotionally prepare themselves for the content that's being created, and just being able to understand, okay, there is going to be a conversation that might make me uncomfortable. Another thing I do is I use humor, obviously appropriately, throughout my lessons. There's memes and stuff, especially when we're talking about the Cold War and more current contemporary events, so that students, kind of have that room to breathe within the lesson, especially if they're feeling that tension being brought up. I also use pop culture a lot throughout my lessons as well. As Catherine was saying, reading comprehension decreases. So if I use movie clips, music, memes, and I even show and use WandaVision in my classroom to teach about ideology, students have a tendency to relate to the characters and the content with a lot less validity, and so they're less volatile when they're engaging with this topic, and then it kind of brings them down and allows them to more deeply engage with what we're talking about after they've kind of had this experience through a medium that they know and they love. Especially if you're going to be bringing in, clips from superhero movies or from Star Wars and stuff, where kids have already been exposed to it for most of their lives, and it's characters that they're already really comfortable with. Bringing up that stuff that kids already have that emotional connection with, and seeing that, hey, we're going to be discussing this difficult topic that you might experience some extreme emotions and resistance towards. But if my character that I have loved for years is able to discuss this content and discuss similar emotions and values and ethics that we're going to be engaging with in class, then maybe I can engage with it as well. So anxiety buffers is something that me as a social studies teacher has to recognize, and why students and me myself react to various situations, to information and situations and stimuli throughout our course. So a lot has to do with mental health right now with COVID. A lot of kids have been thrown back, hey, it's the new normal, and we're going back to the way things used to be, and kind of catch up. This has been a little bit hard on our students, especially here in Alberta. We have what are called diploma exams. So at the end of grade 12, kids have to do a standardized test from the government of Alberta. And it used to, in previous years, it was 30% of their grade overall. This year, it's 20%. They did bring it down. But a lot of students who are in grade 12 are feeling a lot of anxiety that comes with that, and a lot of resistance to taking risks and stuff because they are scared of failing that exam. And a lot of it has to do with their mental health and being like, I don't feel emotionally prepared for this. I don't feel like I have the skills to be able to deal with this. And I don't feel like we are back to normal. So mental health is and something that does create that added layer of anxiety on top of this. In Canada, Indigenous erasure is very alive and well, and we deal with it a lot in social studies. So bringing up Indigenous issues and Indigenousness within the classroom can cause
Hey, Melissa. Oh, good. You're back. Sorry.
If you sorry, did I cut out? Did I cut out?
Back a little bit. We lost your sound.
Oh, sorry.
Right about the time you were talking about Indigenous groups. So if you could just backtrack a little bit.
Yes, no worries. So yes, sorry about that. Yes, so dealing with Indigenous erasure, whether it be in the curriculum, through current events, through us examining historical documents and stuff, and how Indigenousness has been a situation, and whether it's a created situation or a real situation, has been very it creates a lot of volatile emotions for a lot of people, especially with in places like rural Alberta, where we do have a lot of Indigenous communities around us, around the towns and stuff like that. And so we do have students who, residential schools did impact their families, and then other people who don't believe that intergenerational trauma is a thing, and kind of having to take into account how people are reacting to it, and being able to have these healthy discussions without other people using derogation or assimilation or other types of ways to convert people into their worldview, is something that we do grapple with, especially here in Canada. We do talk about things like grand narratives, privileges, the economy and economic tensions, and then also things like emotions, traumas, and experiences outside of our classroom, and how that can bleed within the classroom. So families, violence, the idea of media that people are watching, the different like subreddits and stuff, for example, and what they're exposing themselves to does bleed into our classroom. I did want to share one thing that I had students do last year. So when I was teaching about Ernest Becker and terror management theory to my grade 11 kids, I got them to look at different types of propaganda throughout the 1900s and early 2000s. And we looked at how propaganda evolved. Based on what events were happening, whether it was fear that was being used, whether it was guilting, whether it was questioning the idea of self-esteem, and whether you're being a quote unquote man for war. And I got students to talk about what kind of emotion are they playing off of? How are they dealing with the idea of mortality? And then I got them to do a propaganda survey where they were to choose what their question was going to be for the survey and how they wanted to interact. They wanted their recipients to interact with it, and they had to get people to fill out this survey. One group decided to look at how did people from different age groups respond to the idea of death. And so they had propaganda that was, placating off of fear, some that used humor. They had propaganda that was videos, some that were images, and some that were, news, like articles from Twitter and stuff like that. So things that they had to read. And so they actually found that the younger kids were responding more to the humorous types of propaganda. And the older ones, older people were responding to propaganda that placated off of fear and racism and scapegoating. And so then they wrote a write-up about how the idea of mortality and that fear kind of made it so that different groups based on their age react in different ways. So we did our own little mortality salience project within our classroom, which is kind of neat. Self-esteem, as Sam was saying, is also really big within the classroom. And I've noticed, especially with COVID and kids being more fearful about their grades and their self-esteem being attached to their grades, that they're less likely to take risks. So I do, and I got this idea from Dr. Catherine Van Kessel, about using thought books in my class. So every week, the kids have to do a response to a prompt. It could be a question, it could be a quote, it could be an image, and they have to respond to what we've been learning that week to the thought book. The thought book, though, they're allowed to self-assess themselves. So things that they think, they get to tell me the ways in which they grappled with the knowledge, the ways in which they took risks. And I also give them feedback, and I allow them the opportunity to go back and rework it based on that feedback. And they just have to fill out a form saying, hey, this is how I kind of took your feedback and I ran with it. If they're unable to engage with the prompt that week due to them having maybe something coming out of their own personal world, or the knowledge itself is something that they're resisting in some way, shape, or form, and they're unable to engage with the prompt, they can write instead strategies they will use to help them grapple with the content and what they think they're going to be doing and what they need from me. So in that way, I can, maybe provide extra videos if they're like, I can't read the articles, they're just not clicking for me this week. I could provide them with links to news sources and stuff like that. So that way it's just different modalities for them to be able to engage with the content. And so it really opens up this conversation with each other about why are we having difficulty understanding concepts? Why are we having difficulty engaging with the content? And is it something that the knowledge is just not there, or is it something based off of what is going on in their lives that's causing them to resist with the content? So feedback and assessment, I use a lot of the idea of self-esteem in Ernest Becker. And I discussed it with my kids about the idea of self-esteem being tied to assessment early on, so that kids understand, okay, I'm allowed to take risks. And if I fail, she's going to let me go and rework it. So that way it's healthy failure. And I can also take those risks and challenge myself. So just a couple things that I've talked about with TMT in the classroom. The first is worldview threat and mythology, so talking about nation and creation stories, grand narratives, and collective consciousness and imagined communities. So who's being included in the grand narrative, who's being left out, and why? What kind of stories are we telling? Also villainification and heroification in those grand narratives. Who is being created as the villain, and who's being created the hero of these stories? And are they from individuals? Are they considered groups? And how are they being portrayed? We also talk about worldview threat with assimilation, accommodation, derogation, and annihilation, and how worldview threat leads to human rights abuses and ethical and moral implications. We talk about internationalism and human rights and the idea of human rights, and is human rights universal? When we talk about war and conflict, I use a lot of TMT. Revolutionary movements, both historical and contemporary, in order to try to create some radical hope by us examining the historical and then talking about worldview threat and the idea of mortality historically and applying it to revolutionary movements happening today. Again, through the use of pop culture and talking about some of this difficult knowledge to decrease death anxiety. And
we have lost your sound again, Melissa. I am so sorry.
End us off. The challenge with using TMT as a teacher is there are challenges. It's not, it's not for everybody off the hop, but everybody can get there. So the need to build trust and understanding with students. There is a lot of trust involved because students are trusting you with their emotions and how they're grappling, and they're trusting you to be able to accept their emotions, whether or not you accept their position, but at least accepting that they have these emotions and they're engaging with things emotionally. Holding ourselves accountable to the same, if not higher standards as our students, and recognize when we're engaging with worldview threat and our own mortality, especially if students have opposing worldviews. Being emotionally ready to have difficult discussions with students and have the flexibility if someone is encountering worldview threat and their mortality, and being very kind with that as well, and being able to allow them to have those breaks, allow them to put their head on their desk, allow them to go for a lap around the school, allowing them to be on their phones for a moment, and not having to be so strict there. And then being reflective on our own encounters and experiences with mortality and how it's impacted us personally in our personal lives and how that bleeds into our work. Okay, that's everything for me.
All right, thank you so much. Thanks for sharing your impacts of teaching terror management theory in the high schools. That's definitely a different environment than definitely a different environment than college. So thank you so much for sharing that. And I'm really excited to see where your future work goes, both in graduate school and beyond. So thank you. So for those that are listening in, I know we are a little short on time. We are going to extend this webinar to 9:15 a.m. if you are on the West Coast, and 12:15 p.m. if you are on the East Coast with myself. So I wanted to start with a question for all of you. And then for those watching, if you could please put your questions in the chat so we can get those answered. So your first question I would like to ask is, did the pandemic help or hurt teaching these ideas? Was it harder or easier to teach with the constant ongoing death reminders that we had and still do have?
I would say it's a mix of both. I definitely know for TMT researchers, I think it make it hard because there is no controlled condition. But in terms of teaching about it, in some ways, I think it made it easier because people couldn't deny the fact that death is a big part of their lives. But then I think then there was maybe a bit of a struggle for them to see how that's always been the case. So I found it to be a bit of a mix.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say similar to you, Catherine, that I think the pandemic obviously provides a timely example of Becker's ideas, and I think it helps students understand, therefore, the theory more broadly outside an essay just teaching Becker and terror management theory. I think the pandemic was a hindrance because of the fact we had this all stuff online, and that, you know, I mean, we've experienced a lot of it here, that students didn't really feel part of a community, you know, and that kind of really taps into what Becker talked about, wanting to be kind of part of something greater and to belong to something. And I think ultimately doing things online digitally, it kind of sacrificed that, which I think often then led to students struggling to engage with their studies.
For me, I'm a relatively younger teacher. I've only been teaching for 4 years. So my entire career has been through the pandemic, essentially. I found that it was very difficult teaching online with terror management theory, and I had to definitely be more kind and be more accountable for students, especially when everybody was a black screen for teaching. But in person, I found that the conversations were very fruitful. And so online, difficult, but in person, it was pretty good.
Yeah, I would agree. And especially as we've all talked about being very inclusive and also watching people as they engage with these ideas and making sure that people aren't triggered and making sure that they have appropriate mental health resources on top of everything else that, you know, we were dealing with as well as them during the height of the pandemic, made teaching online particularly challenging because you were not able to see them afterwards. They just signed off, and you're right. Oftentimes they were a black screen. And so to make sure that they are okay was a deep challenge, I think, for all of us. So thank you. So kind of similar, but shifting gears a little bit. We know that in America, at least, there has been some challenges made to course content, specifically with critical race theory, but not limited to that, of course. So I'm wondering, and some of you have talked about the feedback that you have received, and also someone who doesn't always receive positive feedback, right? I'm lucky to be at an institution that supports terror management theory and supports what I'm doing, but that isn't always the case at other places. So I'm curious what feedback you've had from students, from Melissa with and Catherine, when you were teaching with high school parents, and also just general university administration to teaching this content in the classroom. If you'd like to share anything about that.
Yeah, I've had a lot of positive feedback. Things like this helps them talk about really hot button issues in their classroom, but it also helps them at the Turkey Day table. They're like, this helps me talk with my uncle who has some really troubling views, but it allows us to come from this point of care, like to really hold people lovingly accountable for their views. Because I think something that kind of exacerbates things is there's the two sides become quite rigid. And then even though one might argue that there's a more correct side in terms of causing harm, they can not be effective because they're snarky and they're not coming from that place of care. Like I really do think if we want the world to be better, we have to win hearts and minds, which means like no one likes someone who's a jerk. So I think that base humility of all of us, no matter what our ideological stance is. And I did have a compliment. One of the most meaningful compliments I've ever received in my teaching was from a very conservative, small c conservative minded student saying like, I normally don't feel welcome in these conversations because of my political and religious beliefs. You challenged me to think about those, but I always felt welcome. And that really meant a lot. And that's all because of Becker and terror management theory.
I'd say similar to Catherine, that I think when I teach students about these ideas, they seem quite excited, to be honest. I think in comparison to most of the stuff that I have to teach psychologically, I think suddenly you start talking about these ideas, and by and large, I say students really engage with the ideas. I think they are alluring and interesting. And I think because of the broad nature of the ideas that terror management theory and Becker talks about, it's quite easy to see the many different ways it can apply. Even outside of students, I think generally my institution has been very encouraging about teaching these ideas. I mean, obviously there are sensitivities to deal about with teaching them, but I think it's always been taken for granted that I would teach it in a sensitive manner, and there are certain topics that I just choose not to go in within the context of a classroom because I think they're going to be a bit too difficult for maybe students to really listen to. Educators around here have always been very supportive. I mean, we had just one lecture of terror management theory, and then students liked it so much we basically made a whole module about it, and now it's like our second most popular optional module in their final year. So I mean, students seem to really enjoy learning about it, and I think it's a great exercise for them to learn about it.
For me, my students love it. It allows, especially like the more small c conservative students as well, they've told me that they haven't felt welcome in social studies conversations because they feel like, like the teachers might be judging them, or they might grade them more harshly. And when I show them, especially I use the worldview threat thermometer that Catherine put up on the Grim Educated website, and they're like, oh, I'm allowed to have these emotions. You just want me to be reflective on how I express these emotions and kind of how I'm saying it and how I'm reacting to others. I'm like, yeah, like you're allowed to feel things. So the students really enjoy that they're allowed to feel things and they're allowed to engage with the content. They just are more thoughtful in the way in which they present it. From an admin perspective, I had admin that was kind of, well, what's going on here? So I invited her into my classroom to watch me teach TMT. Before I got into our mini genocide unit with the Holocaust. And she sat there and she wrote on my evaluation, she's like, oh, this is everything. And so she actually takes the worldview threat thermometer, and when she is having conversations with students, she actually reflects on it. And she's like, oh, like, let's say where you are at, where do we want to go? And so she's been using that when she is talking to kids about discipline and everything like that. So why did you react? Why did you do this thing? And so it's been a really healthy classroom management tool. And I even use it in parent-teacher interviews where I have it on my desk. And so when parents are asking, oh, like we hear you're talking about that, I'm like, yeah. And then like you're talking about, like this residential schools, and they're like, what are you saying, kind of thing. And I walk them through terror management theory briefly and the worldview threat thermometer, and they're like, oh, so my kid, they can still talk. And the entire conversation with parents is they just want to make sure that their kid is being heard and their kid is being respected. And I've had zero issues using TMT because it encourages that radical hopefulness within conversations. So
yeah, that I really like that. Thank you all. Yeah, I think I just finished teaching about terror management theory alongside my graduate student, Peter Montwill. Many of those students are watching today. And we prefaced this, both of us did, with it changes the way that you view the world, and it affects everything. And so I think when you preface it like that and you frame it like that, it becomes less threatening. But I often get questions from people asking, well, how do you deal with your own death anxiety when you think about this every single day and almost at least once an hour, right? When I'm awake. So yeah, that is interesting. So thank you for that. There are two questions that came in from YouTube, and I'm going to ask the first. They're both related, so I'm going to read the first one, and then we'll chat, and then the second one. Oops, they are not from YouTube; they are from email. So I apologize about my misunderstanding. The first is, oftentimes when I explain Ernest Becker's ideas or terror management theory to people outside of the classroom environment, they get defensive. And I think it's because they perceive that I'm invalidating or trivializing their beliefs. Have any of you found a reliable way to introduce these ideas without coming up against that barrier? And I think we briefly touched on that. And I too experienced this as well, right? Those defensive reactions. So is there anything, I think, specific in regards to that are go-to methods for you?
I mean, something I'll just quickly say, but I'm sure Catherine's got some great ideas about this because she's fantastic in this area, is I think it's really important to emphasize, as Catherine mentioned earlier, that, we're not looking to invalidate anyone's belief. We don't necessarily know what is right or wrong. It's just providing an understanding as to why we need beliefs. And I think another thing related to that to point out is that, really what could be useful to say is that therefore you understand why they believe the things that they do, that there's comfort to be found even if you have a different belief system. There's empathy to be had with somebody else. So I think kind of framing it that way could be, really just kind of getting back to the human of it, just accepting we might believe different things, but, I understand why you believe those things and I respect that.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly, Sam, for sure. And I would just graft onto that. Like I just try to use, like I have kind of a bubbly, goofy personality. And so I use that to kind of wear them down. So exactly as Sam says, like you want to say, like, look, like we all do this. This isn't you're doing it and I don't. We all do it. We do it in different ways. But no one gets to avoid this, and I think that's comfort, comforting for exactly the reason Sam said. And then I, say like, when I say it's all about death, you're probably like, that's ridiculous, and we laugh and we joke about it. Like, I realize this sounds silly, but, let me tell you about this study, and how it works when you're directly talking about it versus subliminal versus just something random, like, just doing an interview in front of a funeral parlor, these sorts of things. You kind of you play around with those ideas and it's a bit disarming, I think. And so you kind of lure them. My good friend, Dr. Manasala, and I talk about the sirens from the story of Odysseus, luring people towards the perilous shores. So that's what we do. We're like, come on, come closer. and I think that helps. So, and I just really emphasize, and I mentioned this briefly in the presentation about, we're not saying they're good or bad. We're just saying, how they function. So we're not asking what's true or what's not true, right or wrong. It's just, this is how they work.
I like that. I like that we all joke about it, right? I mean, we all tell the death jokes. We're all a bit quirky, all of us that do this work. I think that adds to our appeal. But I think it's easy for us to talk about, a lot easier than others. Melissa, did you have a thought before I ask my very last question?
No, pretty much Catherine summarized my thoughts. So.
Awesome. Well, this next question is more of a yes or no, also coming from email, but related. Do you think it might be better when teaching Becker to de-emphasize a person's conscious thoughts of death and instead emphasize their unconscious fears of meaninglessness or insignificance? What do you think?
I think it's a both and. I think it's really important to talk about meaninglessness because, you know, in terms of the lack of significance and death, they're, you know, similar sides. Like the problem of death is then one is potentially rendered insignificant. So I think if we're going to win hearts and minds, I think we have to talk both. I'm not sure we have to necessarily avoid death, but I think being context sensitive. So, you know, everyone in some way, shape, or form so far this morning, or I guess this afternoon for you, Sam, you know, we've talked a little bit about, you know, the context of the pandemic, you know, and there could be someone who literally lost someone yesterday, you know, whereas, you know, we would at least like to think that that maybe happens less often in other times. So I think given that, there's a real value to coming at it from other directions. But I don't think we have to avoid it completely as long as we're taking that appropriate care. And like thinking, Melissa, what you were so powerfully talking about, the multiple ways you create these classrooms of care for these students, giving them like a safe and a brave space to explore that. So I think in moments where we have that, I think we can still roll with death with not reckless abandon, but, you know, more freely, but perhaps without that, you know, that sort of pivot could be really helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I think you took the words out of my mouth. I don't really have much else to add. I think you're right. But, you know, I think there is value in talking about our unconscious concerns, you know, about insignificance and stuff. But I think also, you know, there is value in confronting these things face on as well. You know, I like Yalom a lot alongside Becker because of the fact that he talks about confronting it rather than necessarily just pretending it doesn't exist. You know, so I think it's a bit of both.
Agree.
Well, I lied. I have one last question. And I'm going to start with Melissa since she is in high school, but I definitely want to hear Catherine and Sam's thoughts on this too. What age is too early to talk about this? You know, would elementary, middle school be too early? You know, or how can we modify this to be age appropriate as we have these conversations, you know, younger all the way up through college and older?
I don't think there is an age that's too young. Obviously, you know, as educators and, you know, humans, we definitely change the way in which, like, I'm not going to go to a classroom of grade 1 kids and being like, hey guys, let's talk about the denial of death. And then just how mortality salience, how are you guys feeling about your mortality today? But when we're talking about conversations such as like here in Canada, a big one for our program of studies is, you know, residential schools. We can talk about, you know, students being taken away from homes and having their hair cut and talking about how would they feel and how would you feel, and like kind of getting kids to talk about the emotions and stuff behind that, so we can have discussions about conversations about emotions with students at very young ages, and we can change the language to make it so that it is accessible to them without traumatizing them. But that's even throughout a high school level, depending on who my kids are, because we have streaming in Canada. I'm not sure what it's like in the United States, in the UK, but we stream -1 and -2. And right now I'm teaching a -1, -2, -4, which means that highly academic, they're going to university in the same classroom as kids who don't know how to read and write. all in the same class. And so weaving around those conversations, and, I'm not going to be talking as much towards the idea of like latching onto religion and culture with the -4 kids, but I'm going to talk about, okay, why do you have this emotion when somebody that says something that, you disagree with? And so we can definitely change those conversations, and there's not an age that's too young or a comprehension level that's too young. It's based on, just us using our insights and our expertise with that.
How about the other two? Do you have any thoughts?
I would just say quickly that I think in theory, I agree with Melissa. I personally don't think there is an age too young, but I think my concern would always be, for me, trying to teach someone as they get younger and younger that maybe their parents or somebody else around them might feel differently. And this gets back into that whole worldview thing, right? We see it with sex ed, about what age should we teach students about these kind of things. I think that ideally, it would be great if everyone could get on board with the idea of there's never an early, it's sort of never being too young to learn about these things. But I think I would prefer to take and respect the kind of beliefs that other people might hold about whether maybe somebody else might be too young for this kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's a good approach and a safe one, I think. Catherine?
It's a genuine concern for sure. Well, I mean, I remember reading, I believe this was in The Worm at the Core by the TMT triumvirate, about this, that kids are psychologically aware of death at quite an early age. And that always struck me. And I think a bit about my personal experience. I have a 10-year-old son, and I study evil. And my husband, Jeff Schimmel, is a existential psychologist. So our kid has been learning about death and evil since he was born. So our kid's going to be weird. But I mean, there's gentle ways. Like you change the way you talk about it. Like I'm not going to walk into a class of grade ones and say the words mortality, salience. But there are beautiful books like Duck, Death, and the Tulip, a gorgeous picture book for littles that really gives them a different way to think about death in a more approachable way. And I think Sam brings up an important point of like, well, what will parents say? And this is always why it has to be a team. Like I firmly believe this as an educator of more years than I want to mention, that parents and students and the teacher have to all be on the same team and see each other as such. So thinking, Melissa, of what you said about what you do at parent-teacher interviews, we often set it up as teacher versus student and teacher versus parent and that, but if we're all on the same side, if that communication is open, where we're like, we're talking about this is why, this is how I'm going to do it. What do you think? Let's talk about it. I think we can do a lot more. Any good education at its core is about relationships.
I completely agree. And I was thinking about a colleague that told me a few years ago, pre-pandemic, that her child was asking about death. They ask very early, and this was far, I don't remember the age, but it was far beyond what I thought and what she thought as a developmental psychologist, that they would be asking about this, but nonetheless they did. And that was surprising. Well, thank you all for joining us today. This was a lovely chat, and I wish it could go on all afternoon. We are 3 minutes behind the second time that I said we were done. So I am going to hand it back to Aurora to wrap this thing up. And thank you so much. It was a pleasure chatting with you today.
Thank you, Lindsay. And again, just to echo, thank you everyone who's watching this webinar right now. And thank you, panelists, for your wonderful insights into all this. And thank you, Lindsay, as well. So if you enjoyed this webinar, again, it'd be amazing if you could support the EBF by telling your friends about us and making a donation at our website, or linked in the description to this YouTube video below. There is a place to donate. We operate on a very small budget, and we appreciate any support so much so that we can continue to do things like providing webinars. So if you signed up, we will also send you our communications guide for advocates, which has a lot of really interesting information in it. And please also, if you're interested in keeping up to date with future webinars and news at the Foundation, you can sign up for our monthly emails with the sign up form on our homepage. So thank you all again. I hope you have a good day.
Okay, guys, we're off now.